Hello and welcome to another quilting video. I'm Olivia and today I want to share how I've been binding my quilts lately. I've stopped doing my binding completely by machine, and for the last few quilts I've attached the binding to the front by machine and then to the back with a big stitch type of larger, more decorative hand sewing. It's been a lot more enjoyable and I like the finished results so much better, so stick around and I'll show you how to do it. I'm going to start today with how to make the binding really quickly, and then we'll go into the best way I found to attach it. So if you've already got your binding made or you're not interested in that part of the process today, then skip ahead to the time on the screen now for the second half of the video. The beginning is much the same as any other binding method. I've got my quilt here, it's been quilted, trimmed and squared up and is ready to go. I've got my binding strips cut here. I went for 2.5-inch strips this time, which is a little thicker than I normally go for. I generally prefer 2.25-inch binding strips, but the back of this quilt is quite plain, so I wanted a little bit of a bigger pop of colour there. So play around and see what kind of width you like, but generally 2.5 to 2.25 inches is a good starting point. As normal, I combine the strips by laying one perpendicular to the other and sewing right along the middle here. This will be long enough to give me a good 10 or so inches of excess on each end, so I'll have a good amount of room to get the binding attached nice and neatly. This excess here needs to be trimmed off quickly, and then I just press the seams open to reduce the bulk I'll have to sew through later. Then I go along the length of the binding and press it all in half lengthwise, and then I'm ready to get the show on the road. I always like to start binding around 1/4 of the way from the bottom of the quilt on the right hand side. I don't really have a good reason for this, I've just always done it this way. I think of it as a little less high traffic area of the quilt, so the joint I'll make here later on should stay nice and secure, and if it isn't quite perfect, it won't be front and center and it wouldn't hopefully stand out too much. So working here with the quilt front side up, I leave a good few inches of tail, and I just start sewing from about here, lining up the raw edge of the quilt and the binding right together here. I don't pin, I just go very slowly and I line it up as I go. When it comes to the corners, I sew up to about this point and then I fold the binding on a 45-degree angle like this. It's easy on this quilt because of the 45-degree line here. Then I line the binding back up with the quilt, sew down to the fold line, and then pivot and sew off the edge. Then cut the threads, rotate the quilt, and fold the binding twice. First up this way, lining up the edges of both the binding and the quilt, and then just flip it back over on itself to continue down along this edge. Line the whole thing back up with a needle and right from the far edge. Do a little back stitch and then start sewing again. I continue like this all the way around the quilt until I get close to where I started. At that point I backstitch, take everything down to the floor to combine the two edges of the binding. Because my binding is made from just a single solid fabric, I'm not going to bother to combine them with a diagonal line of stitches like I did earlier. If I were doing a scrappy binding, I would take the time and effort to do that because you'd be able to tell really easily if I didn't. I think that method is slightly stronger and it's definitely easier to sew over because the bulk of the seam is dispersed more, if that makes sense. But for a plain binding like this, I'll generally just do a straight seam across because it's easier and quicker. So I've got the two tails here and I'm going to combine them right around here, I think. Just because I prefer to keep the bulk away from these seams and from the middle here. So I think this looks like a good spot. So I'm going to make a crease with my iron around here and then again here. Then I'm going to head back to the sewing machine and I'm going to open the fold up and sew them together. Before I do anything else, let's just quickly check I didn't end up with too much or too little binding here. Sometimes it needs a little adjustment, but that looks good. So I trim off the excess, press the seams open, and then finish up sewing along to where I started. Now the binding is all attached to the front of the quilt. One of my favorite binding tricks is to press the binding back this way before moving on. I didn't do this for a long time, and it just makes the front of the binding so much neater and tighter later on. Now we get to the hand sewing part of the whole thing. So for the rest of this process, I'll need my hand sewing needles. I don't have any particular favorite, I just pick what's closest. My thread, which is this white DMC pearl cotton, and my little embroidery scissors. I like to start this part of the process just a little bit above the seam where I joined the start and the end of the binding earlier. I take a good arm's length of thread on my needle, make a knot, then fold the binding down around the edge of the quilt and hold it into place. I don't pin or clip my binding just because I've never bothered to buy any clips. To begin, I go in through the edge here, wiggle the needle through the middle of the batting a little bit, and then pull it up through the binding from below like this. And then it's just a matter of keeping my stitches even and making sure I don't push the needle through to the front of the quilt. It always takes a little moment to get into the rhythm of these two things, but it doesn't take long to figure out just how much pressure is needed to get through the binding and the backing into the batting and then back through to the outside again. This part is very repetitive and slow. I like to pick the binding up while watching a movie or something, and I finally know why people say they enjoy the slow process of hand binding a quilt as the last step of working on it. When I used to machine sew the entire binding on, it was like a race to be finished with a quilt. But taking the time to hand sew this final step is actually really nice, which I didn't quite expect. When the thread runs out, it's no different to finishing or starting a new length of hand stitching, so I won't go into that here. I have another video about that down below, so I'll link it there for you. When I get to the corners, the binding should fold into position pretty easily thanks to the way it's attached on the front, but it can be a little fiddly. Just play around with it, make sure you've got the right side on top, because if you look here like this, clearly one of them is the better choice. So I hold it down and stitch right up to this point. Then I make sure the new edge is positioned right, and I do a couple of stitches up in the corner here. Sometimes I do straight stitches across like this. Sometimes I do one stitch, but I stitch over it a couple of times. You can make a little cross for a bit more decorative touch. You've got options. And then it's back to straight stitches along the next side of the quilt. As I said earlier, it's repetitive, it's slow. If it's summer, it's hot, but in the winter it's great because you're covered up by a lovely new quilt you've been working on, and now you get to enjoy it while you finish it. Hand-sewn bindings are something special, particularly if you've machine quilted everything else. It adds a nice little, obviously handmade element to your quilt, and I think that's really nice. Another thing I do as I'm quilting, every now and then, I'll just make a knot, just to make sure that if it ever got caught and started unraveling or anything, it wouldn't, unravel the entire binding. I don't have any particular rule for how often I do that, it's kind of just when I remember it, but I like to think it makes it a bit more secure. So I hope this video was helpful. If it was, please give it a like down below and consider subscribing to my channel for more quilting videos and tutorials like this one. Thanks for spending time watching today, and I'll see you next time.